Hello again. My name is Daniel Neiman. I'm the captain of the ship here, and we are going to talk about, this lecture is going to be about how science tries to explain away the paranormal. And again, we're covering topics in my book, Into the Light. Now, there's more information in the book than I talk about in the lectures, and also I might throw some things into the lectures that aren't in the book. But let's go ahead and get started. So, scientists, we were explaining in the last video, tend to try and just ignore the paranormal, but sometimes they do investigate it and they try to explain it away. Now, the first example of this I want to go to is about UFOs. Now, UFOs are a big topic, the latter half of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, still very relevant topic of discussion. And the first case I want to go to, I cover in my book here, and it involves a physicist, an optical physicist. His name was Bruce Maccabee. And there was a UFO sighting, a series of sightings in Kaikoura, New Zealand. So Bruce Maccabee heard about these sightings and went down to investigate what was going on there. Now, and I'm getting this from Thomas Bullard. He's a very famous academic and researcher into the topic of UFOs. And in his book, The Myth and Mystery of UFOs, he talks about this case where there was multiple witnesses, movie footage, and radar tracking of these UFOs in the sky. So Bruce Maccabee goes down there, investigates for a good month, interviews the witnesses, takes a look at all the evidence there is for these UFO sightings, and he basically comes to the conclusion that, you know, this is not a terrestrial phenomenon. This cannot be explained away. That these are real UFOs up there that we cannot explain. So basically it's not a planet. It's not the motion of the stars. You know, it's not any natural explanation that we can think of. But later on, Bruce Maccabee read an article in a journal, it was a journal article, explaining how there was nothing to these sightings. All it was refracted lights from Japanese squid boats. So, very easy, brushing it off. It's no big deal. It's just these refracted lights from Japanese squid boats people see in the air, and there's nothing to it. Now, Bruce Maccabee, he knew that was not a good explanation because he had done a lot of research. He actually went there and did his research and interviewed the witnesses and whatnot. So he decided to write a rebuttal to the editor of this journal article and explain why he thought they were real UFOs. But they didn't even allow him to get published in the scientific journal. Thomas Bullard says the editor rejected his article, saying it contained no real science, in an apparent demonstration that a study based on extensive investigation did not merit publication if it arrived at an unacceptable answer. While a study based on nothing more than newspaper reports breezed into print, as long as its results conform to proper scientific explanation. So what Bullard is suggesting there is that whoever wrote this journal article was basing his conclusions on newspaper reports of the sightings and didn't actually do any in-depth investigation such as Bruce Maccabee did. But because the original article's author conformed to scientific thought that, you know, there's no real UFOs, all these things can be explained naturally, because it conformed to the standard scientific thought, he got right into a scientific journal. But Bruce Maccabee, who's trying to say that there's an unexplained phenomenon going on, he's, you know, not even allowed to publish his rebuttal in the journal article. So that's a good example of scientists trying to explain away, just refracted lights. And of course, you know, especially if there's radar tracking, how do you track on radar refracted lights? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, that's a lot of times what scientists will do. They'll come up with any explanation that they can think of, just to ease their mind so they don't have that cognitive dissonance. That's a psychological term. When there's an observation or something that doesn't conform with your prior beliefs, you have to try and get rid of that tension in your mind. And so the easy way to do it is just to brush it off or explain it away. In the last video, we were talking about mediumship. Now, it was common for mediums to be, the scientists, skeptical scientists would try to explain away what was going on in the seances. And they would come up with anything possible. I mean, some of these seances were pretty thorough. I mean, they would strip search the medium before the seance, make sure they didn't have any special tools hidden on them. They would hold the hands and feet. Investigators would hold each hand and each foot during the seance to make sure that they were not responsible for the levitations or for the phenomenon that happened. But even if even if the medium, and again, the medium's in a trance, she's not even really, her conscious mind is not even really there sometimes. Even if the medium got like a foot free from the investigator's hand, and then something happened, even if, having her foot free from the investigator's hand could not explain what happened during that time, they would say, she got a foot free. She was obviously cheating. Okay? But sometimes, it couldn't explain the phenomenon anyway. Or they might find a piece of string on the floor after the seance and say, she must have used that piece of string to move the furniture or do whatever, even though it's not even really plausible that that could have been the case. Other times they would make stuff up. Like, there was a trap door and she had someone coming in through this trap door as an accomplice during the seance, moving the stuff around. And later they investigated and found that there really was no trap door, but that doesn't matter. It's just whatever explanation, no matter how absurd, or even if it doesn't fit all the evidence, if it can explain something, or if it can ease your mind, you're going to jump on that explanation. Okay, that's not to say that mediums never actually, what would I say, never actually deliberately cheated. I mean, that did happen sometimes, but a lot of times they were just looking for anything to ease their minds, these skeptical scientists, and just trying to explain it away. But let's get back to the modern day. Now, the next example comes from SciCop, the Scientific Committee for the Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, still an active organization today. Although Chris Carter, who's a very good author on these psychic phenomena, he says in his book that they've really only done one investigation in their entire time as being an organization. I mean, look at their name, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. They should be the ones out testing for telepathy. They should be the ones out doing the investigations. But Chris Carter explains really they're a debunking organization. All they want to do is explain away claims of the paranormal. So a better name for this organization would be the Scientific Committee for Explaining Away the Paranormal. That's what they should be called, because they don't actually do investigations. They just ridicule the work of other parapsychological researchers. But they did do one investigation, and I cover this in my book. It's also in Chris Carter's book, Science and Psychic Phenomena. But it involves astrology. And you talk about a topic scientists really don't like or really ridicule, and it would be astrology. But a couple of French psychologists, Michel and François Scacolin, and those are French names, so I might have murdered the names. I'm sorry if I did. But they claimed that significantly more world-class athletes were born when Mars was rising or transiting. So this is dealing with astrology, which is kind of a complex science. But basically, depending on where the planets are in their relationship, their geometrical or angle of relationship between the planets and the Earth at the time someone is born, the planets will have certain influences, psychologically, at least that's the theory. Or maybe the planets themselves don't influence the psychology of a person, but it's some correlation that they found, which I point out in my book, could even suggest there's a deeper underlying intelligence coordinating the entire universe, so that our psychological dynamics are reflected in the positions of the planets, sort of as this meaningful correlation that suggests there's some underlying intelligence directing all this. Although there could be some subtle energy influencing our psychology that we just haven't found, that's coming off of the planets. I mean, it's really a mystery. But anyway, they said that all these world-class athletes, they have Mars rising or transiting at the time of these athletes' birth more than the normal population. Now, Mars is associated in astrology with traits such as aggression, warlike tendencies, being a warrior, being aggressive. And so the hypothesis is that if you have those aggressive sort of traits, those competitive aggressive traits, then that would make you a better athlete, or that would influence you to become more of a world-class athlete than the normal person. So, as Chris Carter points out in his book, the Gackelin's results showed that 22% of European sports champions were born with Mars rising or transiting. And since the Gackelins divided the sky into 12 sectors, according to pure chance, the probability of Mars being in any two sectors of one's time of birth is 2 in 12, or 17%, which is well below the 22% reported with the sample of 2,088 sports champions. The odds against chance with that kind of sample size, 2,088, he says, are millions to one against it resulting via chance. So the sports champions, they're born with Mars rising or transiting, which means Mars is going to influence them more than the average person. They're going to have these more aggressive competitive traits. That's going to help them to become world-class athletes. And 22%, so just a higher percentage of the sports champions than you would expect by pure chance have this thing going on. So, of course, the PsyCop organization, they think this is all hocus pocus. They think, these psychologists must be doing something wrong. So they decide to investigate. And they basically took a random sample of just regular people from different professions, and they matched that against the sample of champions. So they took people who were born about the same time and year as the champions, and they thought, maybe most people are born when Mars is rising or transiting. Maybe people in general have that. Maybe people in general, when they're born, they show Mars rising or transiting. Maybe that's just some natural thing that we can use to explain that. But anyway, the results showed that the matched sample of normal people had Mars rising or transiting 17% of the time when they were born, at the time they were born. Of course, that's chance level. That's exactly what you would expect by pure chance. Okay, so it's well below the 22% reported by the world-class sports champions. So instead of accepting that maybe there is some Mars effect, as they call it, some influence of Mars, or some correlation there, instead of accept this, they decided to try and explain it away. So what they did was they used some tricky little tactics, and they divided, first of all, they excluded female athletes. So they said, okay, we're just going to get rid of the female athletes, not include those in the study. And then they divided the other male champions by geographical location. So different areas in Europe. And what they're effectively doing is they're reducing the sample size. So if you're only looking at a small geographical area, like this area has 22 sports champions in it, and then you try and determine what percentage of the time they have Mars rising or transiting in their birth chart, well, you might get a significant deviation from chance. Like it might be 22 or 25%, but it's not significant because of the low sample size. It could be due to just chance, so it's not above chance levels as when you pool the 2088 together. So the larger the sample of sports champions, the better the results are going to be, and the less likely they're going to be due to chance. But when you only have a small sample size, chance becomes a factor. It could be due to chance. So that's what they did, and they looked at just the champions for each geographical locale, and again, it wasn't outside of the realm of chance possibility, so they dismissed it. The only area that had more sports champions was Paris. You know, that's got a larger population, so there's more people. And that was well outside of chance. That was significant, but that was the only area, so they could kind of dismiss that as an anomaly. But really what they were doing was they were just butchering the entire study just to ease their minds, just to explain it away, remove that cognitive dissonance, right? Okay, because if, you know, we do have this correlation between the planets and our psychology, then that really suggests a deeper order to the universe, a deeper order that just shouldn't be there according to modern scientific thinking. Okay, another interesting example, and not many paranormal researchers bring this up, but I found this in Stanislav Grof's book, When the Impossible Happens, and that's an excellent book, one of my favorites of all time on the paranormal. It's called When the Impossible Happens. Stanislav Grof is a famous psychiatrist, actually co-founded the transpersonal psychology field. So, a very interesting guy. He did a lot of research throughout his life with altered states of consciousness. And he met with Carl Sagan. Now, Carl Sagan is maybe one of the most famous astronomers of all time, very famous scientist, also was a member of that PsyCop organization. And basically, Carl Sagan wanted to talk to him about this new field that Stanislav Grof was pioneering called transpersonal psychology. And he wanted to talk about the theory related to that. Okay, so he met Carl Sagan, Grof did, and he says at one point during the meeting, he explained to Sagan a near-death experience case. And we're going to talk about near-death experiences more in the next video. But I just wanted to end this video with this case because it's a good lead-in to our next video. So a near-death experience reported by a cardiologist named Michael Sabam in his book, Recollections of Death. And it involves a man who, after undergoing resuscitation, after a cardiac arrest, he reported details of what was happening during the resuscitation efforts. So he experienced himself out of body, his consciousness in a corner of the room or in the room somewhere outside of his body, and he could see what was going on during his operations. And he was so detailed. That's what surprised Michael Sabam, was the level of detail about what happened during his operation that he was able to provide. And one quote from Grof, he said, he was able to reconstruct, to Michael Sabam's surprise, the entire procedure, including the movements of the little hands on the measuring devices, in correlation with the interventions of the surgical team. So he was able to say, this needle moved like this when you did this, and he was able to just give a very detailed report of what happened during his resuscitation. And this is things outside of general knowledge, which he could have been able to know by watching TV or whatever. Okay, so having described a case like this, a very detailed out-of-body perception that was verified by this cardiologist, he asked Carl Sagan to respond. Like, how would you interpret this? What do you think is going on here? Because he knew Carl Sagan was an atheistic scientist who didn't believe in life after death and the paranormal. And so he's basically challenging him. He's like, okay, how do you explain this? And here is where it gets funny, because this is Carl Sagan's reply. He says, this, of course, did not happen. And, Groff's looking at him like, what? What do you mean it didn't happen? Here's a cardiologist, a doctor, a trained medical doctor, reporting this in his book. This is what his patient experienced, and this is what his patient told him. So he said, let's see here. He said, what is your explanation? He asked him again, what is your explanation for what I have just described to you? What do you think this is all about? And this time he said Carl Sagan kind of sat back and was thinking a while before he answered. And then his answer was, I'll tell you. There are many cardiosurgeons in the world. Nobody would have known the guy. So he made up a wild story to attract attention to himself. It's a PR trick. So basically, Groff realizes that, here's a man, even though he's a famous scientist and supposedly interested in investigating in a scientific manner and finding out the truth of things, really, he's just protecting an atheistic belief system. He's protecting his scientific belief system that this is not possible. And instead of looking at the evidence and trying to explain it, all he's doing is trying to explain it away as, this doctor must want to make a bunch of money. He's creating this wild story, just to get publicity or to make money. Okay? So, that's a great example of just trying to explain it away any way possible, instead of confronting the evidence. Now, I wish Carl Sagan were alive today, because today you've got many more doctors reporting these near-death experiences, especially Pim van Lommel. He did a study on cardiac arrest patients, and we're going to get into some of his work in the next video. So it's not just people making it up for PR tricks. We have a lot of research going on with near-death experiences, and that's going to be the topic of our next video. So stay tuned, everybody. Now remember, get the book if you want to learn more. I've got more information in the book. Of course, not everything I talk about is in the book, because I am adding things to the videos, so remember that. But I encourage you to watch the videos and read the book, and we're going to be back for another lecture on near-death experiences and evidence for the afterlife, so don't miss it.